The dimly lit alley smelled of rain and secrets. Daniel Cross crouched behind a dumpster, camera in hand, heart pounding in sync with the city's distant sirens. He had spent months tracking Anton Voss, a shadowy figure linked to money laundering, drug trade, and political corruption. Tonight, he was close, closer than ever. Through his camera lens, Daniel watched as Voss exited the back door of an upscale restaurant, shaking hands with a man in a dark suit. The exchange was brief, but the tension in the air was thick. Daniel clicked the shutter, capturing every movement, every expression. He was one step away from exposing the biggest story of his career. Then, in the reflection of a rain-slicked window, something caught his eye. A familiar silhouette. A woman. His heart stopped. Seated near the window of the restaurant was Emily, his wife, and across from her sat a man Daniel didn't recognize. They leaned in close, talking, laughing. Her fingers brushed against the man's hand, a gesture that was all too intimate. Daniel's stomach twisted. This wasn't just dinner. This was something else, but he had no time to process it now. First, the story. Then, Emily. He turned back to his camera, but Voss was gone. Cursing under his breath, Daniel bolted from the alley, heading toward his car. He needed to regroup, follow up on his leads, and, most importantly, find out what the hell Emily was doing with that man. The crash happened fast. One moment he was gripping the steering wheel, mind racing. The next, headlights blinded him. Tires screeched, metal crunched, pain exploded in his skull. Then, darkness. Daniel woke up to the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. His body ached, his vision blurred. Hospital walls, white ceiling, the scent of antiseptic. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his ribs stopped him. A nurse rushed in. "Mr. Cross, take it easy. You've been in an accident." "How long have I been here?" His voice was hoarse. 2 days. 2 days? His pulse quickened. He remembered driving, the headlights, the impact. But everything else was a fog. Then Emily's face flashed in his mind. The restaurant. The man. He tried to focus. "What about my car? My phone?" "The police recovered your vehicle. You suffered a head injury, Mr. Cross. Some memory loss is normal." Memory loss? Panic gripped him. What had he forgotten? And more importantly, what had been taken from him? To be continued. Let me know if you want to adjust the pacing or add anything. Daniel gritted his teeth as he forced himself upright in the hospital bed. His head throbbed, his ribs ached, but none of it mattered. He needed answers. A knock at the door made him tense. A moment later, Emily walked in. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression a mix of worry and exhaustion. She rushed to his bedside. "Daniel," she breathed, reaching for his hand. "God, you scared me." He let her touch him, but his mind was elsewhere, back in that restaurant, back to her sitting across from that man. "How do you feel?" she asked softly. "Like I got hit by a truck," he muttered. "What happened?" She hesitated. "The police said it was an accident. Some drunk driver ran a red light. You were lucky." An accident. Daniel frowned. That didn't sit right with him. He had been careful, alert, and yet he had no memory of the impact, no recollection of anything after leaving the alley. His gut told him there was more to this. He studied Emily's face. She looked genuinely shaken, but that didn't erase what he'd seen. The image of her laughing with another man burned into his mind. "Have I said anything weird since waking up?" he asked, testing the waters. She blinked. "What do you mean?" "Like something about before the crash. Something important." Emily shook her head. "No, Daniel, you've been unconscious most of the time." "Why?" He held her gaze, searching for cracks in her concern. "Just trying to put the pieces together," he said. "That's all." She nodded, squeezing his hand. "You should focus on resting. The doctor said your memory might take time to fully return. He forced a tight smile. Yeah, time. But inside, alarms were blaring. Something wasn't right, and he was going to find out exactly what. Daniel sat in his hospital bed long after Emily had left, staring at the blank TV screen. The throbbing in his head had dulled, but the storm inside him only grew stronger. His instincts had never failed him before, and right now they were screaming at him. Something was off, not just about the crash, but about Emily, about everything. And if his instincts were right, then the truth was buried somewhere in the 48 hours he couldn't remember. The next morning, Daniel convinced the nurse to let him check out early. His ribs ached and his body protested with every movement, but he ignored it. He needed to retrace his steps. His first stop was the alleyway where he had last seen his target, the criminal he had been investigating. If someone wanted him dead, that was where the trail would start. But as soon as he got there, he saw something that made his blood run cold. His car, or what was left of it. The wreck had been towed to a nearby impound lot. The front end was crumpled beyond recognition, the windshield shattered. But that wasn't what made Daniel's stomach tighten. It was the long, deep gash along the side of the car, like someone had run him off the road. This wasn't just an accident. Someone had tried to kill him. And if that was true, then what else had been a lie? Emily's words echoed in his head. The police said it was an accident. Had they? Or had she just told him that so he wouldn't ask questions? Daniel clenched his fists. He was done playing the victim. It was time to start getting some real answers. Daniel left the impound lot with his mind racing. Someone had tried to kill him, and if Emily had lied about the police report, it meant she was either hiding something or protecting someone. He needed proof. Step 1. The police report. Daniel headed straight to the police station, forcing himself to walk steadily despite the dull pain in his ribs. Inside, he approached the front desk, where a tired-looking officer barely glanced up from his paperwork. I was in a car accident 2 days ago. I need a copy of the report. The officer sighed, tapping at his computer. Name? Daniel Cross. The officer frowned. Nothing under that name. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. That's impossible. I was in a crash. It should be there. The officer shook his head. No report under your name. Maybe it wasn't processed yet? Or maybe it was erased. Daniel forced a smile. I'll check back later. He left, his hands clenched into fists. If there was no report, it meant someone had made sure it never existed, and that someone was covering their tracks. Daniel's next stop was home. Emily wasn't expecting him, and he planned to keep it that way. Parking a block away, he approached the house cautiously. Instincts honed from years of investigative work kicking in. The curtains were drawn, but he could see a faint glow inside. She was home. Daniel reached into his pocket for his keys, but then hesitated. He wanted the truth. And sometimes, the truth wasn't found by asking questions. Sometimes, you had to catch it in the act. Instead of unlocking the front door, he moved around the house to the back patio, pressing himself against the wall as he listened. Voices. Emily's. And another man's. Daniel's stomach twisted. He peeked through the glass door. Emily sat on the couch, her back to him, her hands gripping a man's arm. He was partially turned away, but Daniel could see his face in the reflection of a nearby mirror. It was someone he recognized. Someone from his investigation. His breath caught. His wife was involved with the very people he had been tracking. Suddenly, Emily laughed softly, touching the man's face. The way she looked at him, like she trusted him, cared for him, made Daniel's blood boil. This wasn't just an affair. This was a betrayal on a whole different level. And whatever game Emily was playing, he was done being a pawn. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. Bursting in now wouldn't get him answers. It would only alert them that he was onto them. He needed to know exactly what Emily was involved in. Slowly, he pulled out his phone and hit record. The voices inside became clearer as he adjusted the audio settings, straining to catch every word. "Are you sure he doesn't remember anything?" the man asked. Daniel froze. Emily exhaled sharply. "I don't think so. He's been acting confused, asking questions. But if he had any real memories, he wouldn't have come home so easily." Daniel's grip tightened on his phone. They had been waiting for him to return home. The man scoffed. "We can't risk it. If he starts piecing things together, it's over. You know what needs to be done." There was a long silence. Then Emily spoke, her voice lower now. "I don't want to hurt him. He's still my husband. Not anymore. You made your choice." Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. What choice? Then Emily's voice softened. "I just need a little more time." The man stood abruptly. "We don't have time. If he remembers what really happened that night, we're all screwed." Daniel's breath hitched. What really happened? Something about his accident. Emily sighed. "Fine. I'll handle it." Daniel backed away from the window, his heart hammering. His own wife was working against him. She was keeping secrets about his accident. And now she was planning to handle him, which meant he was running out of time. To be continued. This is getting intense. Want me to push the twists even further? Daniel forced himself to take slow, measured breaths as he stepped away from the house. His mind raced. Emily and that man, whoever he was, were hiding something big. And if they thought he might remember the truth, they were planning to get rid of him. He couldn't go inside. Not yet. Instead, he slipped back into his car and drove away, his hands gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. First stop, the hospital. If his memory loss was connected to something bigger, maybe his medical records could tell him more. Daniel parked outside the hospital and walked through the automatic doors, his heart pounding. He approached the front desk, forcing a polite smile. "Hi, I was recently a patient here. Daniel Cross. I'd like to see my medical records." The receptionist glanced up. "You'll need to fill out a request form. One moment." She turned to a computer, clicking through files. But when she looked back at him, her expression changed. "Actually, it looks like your records have been restricted." Daniel's stomach dropped. Restricted? By who? She hesitated. "I don't know. It just says access is denied unless authorized by the attending physician." His heart pounded. Someone had locked down his medical files. Someone didn't want him seeing them. "Who was my doctor?" She scanned the screen. Dr. Adrian Locke. Daniel's mind clicked. That name sounded familiar. Then it hit him. Dr. Locke was the same doctor who had been listed in one of his investigations months ago. A case involving illegal medical experiments. Coincidence? Not a chance. Daniel found Dr. Locke's office down a quiet hallway. He knocked, pushing the door open when a voice called out, "Come in." Inside, Dr. Locke, a man in his late 40s with graying hair and sharp eyes, looked up from his desk. "Mr. Cross," he said calmly, as if he'd been expecting him. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Daniel stiffened. "Why are my records restricted?" Locke sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Because someone doesn't want you." He hacked into the drive, searching for any hidden files. A folder appeared, labeled Horizon. His gut twisted. Horizon was the criminal network he had been investigating before the accident. The very people he had been tracking. He clicked the folder open. Inside were documents, surveillance photos, financial records. But one thing made his blood run ice cold. A photo of Emily. She wasn't just connected. She was involved. Daniel barely had time to process this when he heard a noise outside his office. A soft creak. He wasn't alone. He grabbed the USB drive and shut his laptop. Quietly, he reached for the small gun he kept in his desk drawer. Then, footsteps. Someone was right outside his door. Daniel held his breath, his finger tightening on the trigger. The doorknob turned. The door creaked open. Daniel held his gun steady, aiming at the shadow moving inside. "Don't move." His voice was low, controlled. The figure hesitated before stepping into the light. Emily. She froze when she saw the gun. "Daniel, what are you doing?" Daniel's grip tightened. "I should be asking you that." Emily's eyes darted to his desk, where his laptop was still warm. "You remember, don't you?" "I remember enough," Daniel said coldly. "You were there when I was attacked. And that man, the one you were with at the cafe, he's not just some random guy, is he?" Emily took a shaky breath. "Daniel, please put the gun down. Let me explain." "Explain what? That you've been lying to me? That you were working with Horizon?" She flinched. The mention of the name confirmed his worst fears. Daniel lowered the gun slightly, but didn't put it away. "Start talking." Emily looked at the door as if expecting someone else to walk in. Then she took a slow step closer. "They told me you were going to die, Daniel." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was trying to save you." Daniel's chest tightened. "Save me? By setting me up?" Emily shook her head. You were getting too close. You were onto something that could have gotten you killed. I tried to steer you away, but you wouldn't stop. That's why they came after you. I didn't know they would go that far. I swear." "Who's they?" Daniel pressed. Emily hesitated. "Horizon." And she swallowed hard. "Ethan Monroe." The name sent a jolt through Daniel's spine. Ethan Monroe was one of the most elusive figures in the criminal underworld. A ghost. A myth. But if he was real, and if Emily was connected to him, Daniel's stomach churned. "You were working for him?" Emily's lips trembled. "I didn't have a choice." A loud bang echoed through the apartment. A gunshot. The window behind them shattered. Daniel tackled Emily to the floor just as another bullet tore through the air. They were out of time. The gunfire didn't stop. Bullets tore through the walls, shattering picture frames and embedding into furniture. Daniel pressed Emily down, shielding her with his body. "We need to move," he hissed. Emily nodded, terror in her eyes. Daniel grabbed his gun and in one fluid motion, flipped the coffee table over for cover. He peeked through the shattered window, but saw nothing. Whoever was shooting at them was using a silencer. "Back exit," Emily whispered. Daniel didn't hesitate. He pulled her up and led her through the hallway. Another bullet whizzed past, hitting the doorframe just as they slipped into the stairwell. "Who the hell is after us?" Daniel demanded as they rushed down the stairs. Emily's breathing was ragged. "If they're shooting at me too, then we both have a problem." Daniel's mind raced. Was this Horizon tying up loose ends? Or was this Ethan Monroe himself? They reached the ground floor. Daniel shoved open the emergency exit, his gun still raised. Nothing. The street was dark and eerily silent. He pulled Emily into the shadows of an alley. "Talk. Now." She wiped a streak of blood from her forehead, probably from the glass shards. "I told you. Ethan Monroe didn't want you investigating further. He thinks you have something." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Something like what?" Emily bit her lip. "I don't know, but he's scared." That caught Daniel off guard. Ethan Monroe, one of the most powerful underground figures in the city, was scared? That meant Daniel had something, even if he didn't know what it was. But first, he had to survive. A car screeched to a stop at the end of the alley. Headlights flooded the darkness. Emily grabbed Daniel's wrist. "Run!" Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Emily's hand and they sprinted down the alley as the car doors slammed open behind them. Heavy footsteps followed. More than one pursuer. Gunfire erupted, bullets ricocheting off the brick walls. Daniel pulled Emily down just as a round zipped past his ear. They needed cover. Up ahead, an old chain-link fence blocked the alley's exit. "Climb!" Daniel shouted. Emily scrambled up first, her fingers slipping against the cold metal. Daniel followed, but as he reached the top, a bullet tore through his jacket. The taxi sped down the deserted streets, the tension inside thick as smoke. Daniel's heart still pounded from the chase, but his mind raced even faster. Emily was breathing heavily beside him, clutching her arms. "This is insane! They were trying to kill us, Daniel!" He ran a hand through his hair, staring out the shattered rear window. "Yeah, which means we're onto something." The driver glanced at them through the mirror. "You two just made my night real interesting." "Where to?" Daniel hesitated. "A hotel. Somewhere quiet." The driver nodded, weaving through traffic before stopping outside a rundown motel on the city's outskirts. Daniel paid in cash, and they slipped inside. The place smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke, but it would do for now. Inside the room, Emily sat on the bed, still shaken. "What do we do now?" Daniel paced. He needed answers. His memory was still patchy, but flashes were coming back. Pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit yet. He sat down across from Emily. "Let's go over what we know. You found me after the accident. I couldn't remember the last 48 hours. She nodded. "Right. You started remembering little things, like the alley, and..." Daniel's eyes widened as another memory slammed into place. "The storage unit." Emily frowned. "What?" "I remember a storage unit, a metal door, a passcode." He rubbed his temples. "I think I hid something there." Emily leaned forward. "Do you know where it is?" He shook his head. "Not yet. But if I left something for myself, it has to be important." A sudden knock at the door made them both freeze. Daniel instinctively reached for his gun, motioning for Emily to stay quiet. He crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. Another knock. More insistent this time. Daniel unlocked the safety on his gun and slowly opened the door. A woman stood there, drenched from the rain. Long dark hair clung to her pale face, and her eyes, filled with something between fear and urgency, locked onto his. "Daniel." Her voice was barely a whisper. "We need to talk. Now." Daniel didn't move. His stomach twisted as he recognized her. It was his wife. For a long moment, Daniel couldn't speak. Emily stiffened behind him, and he could feel the weight of her stare. His wife, stood in front of him, drenched from the rain, looking both terrified and desperate. "Emily," he finally said, his voice low. "What the hell are you doing here?" Her gaze flicked past him toward the dimly lit motel room. "Can I come in?" Daniel hesitated. The last time he'd seen Emily, she had been sitting in a cafe with another man, smiling in a way that made his stomach twist. Then the accident happened. The missing 48 hours. The hitman. And now here she was, showing up like a ghost from a life he barely remembered. Behind him, the other Emily, Emily Carter, crossed her arms. "Is this really a good idea?" she asked. Daniel ignored her and stepped aside. "Get in." Emily Rivers walked in quickly, her wet clothes clinging to her body. She smelled of rain and faint traces of perfume. She glanced at Emily Carter, her eyes narrowing slightly, but said nothing. Daniel shut the door and turned to face her. "Start talking." She let out a shaky breath. "Daniel, you're in danger," he scoffed. "No kidding. People have been trying to kill me all night. Maybe you can explain why?" Emily hesitated. I can't tell you everything, but I swear, I never meant for this to happen." Daniel clenched his fists. For what to happen? You disappearing? Lying to me? Sitting in a cafe with another man while I was out risking my life? Or maybe the part where someone wiped out 48 hours of my memory? Emily's eyes widened. Wait, what? Daniel exchanged a glance with Emily Carter. You didn't know? Emily Rivers shook her head. I had no idea. Daniel stepped closer. Then tell me what you do know. She swallowed hard. Daniel, there's a reason I was at that cafe. That man, he's not who you think he is. And if you don't remember what happened after, then we have a much bigger problem. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. Emily Carter cut in. Why should we believe you? Emily Rivers met Daniel's gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. Because, Daniel, the people who erased your memory, they're the same people who are coming for me next. Silence filled the motel room. The only sound was the steady dripping of rain from Emily Rivers' soaked coat onto the floor. Daniel's mind raced. If she was telling the truth, then his missing memories were connected to something much bigger than just her betrayal. He took a slow breath. Start from the beginning. Emily wiped a strand of wet hair from her face. I can't tell you everything. Daniel's patience snapped. Cut the cryptic act, Emily. My life is on the line. Your life is on the line. And unless you start talking, I don't see why I shouldn't walk out that door and leave you to deal with it yourself. She flinched, but then her expression hardened. You think I wanted this? She shot back. You think I wanted to betray you? Daniel narrowed his eyes. That's exactly what it looked like. She hesitated, her hands trembling at her sides. It wasn't like that, she whispered. Emily Carter crossed her arms. Then explain. Because right now, you're out of time and out of trust. Emily Rivers exhaled sharply, then looked Daniel in the eye. The man I met at the cafe. His name is Julian Ross. He's not just some guy. He's an intelligence operative. He approached me months ago, claiming you were in danger. That something about your investigations had made you a target. He told me that if I wanted to keep you safe, I had to help him. Daniel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Help him how? Emily swallowed. By keeping you distracted. By keeping you away from certain stories. He said if I didn't, they would come for you. And they wouldn't let you live. Daniel stared at her, trying to process her words. So what? He said darkly. You thought sleeping with him would help? Emily's face paled. No, it wasn't like that. I met him a few times, but I never... She cut herself off. Daniel's jaw clenched. Never what? Emily shut her eyes for a moment before whispering, I never wanted to betray you, Daniel. But I was scared. I was trying to protect you. Daniel let out a humorless laugh. You expect me to believe that? Emily Carter shifted, arms still crossed. This is all very touching, she said dryly. But here's a real question. If this Julian Ross guy was so interested in protecting Daniel, why the hell is he missing 48 hours of his life? Emily Rivers turned pale. I don't know. Daniel studied her. She seemed genuinely shocked, but he wasn't sure if he could believe her anymore. Then let's find out, he said. Emily Carter raised an eyebrow. And how do you plan on doing that? Daniel grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a familiar name. If Julian Ross is real, we're going to make him talk. The call rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Who is this? Daniel tightened his grip on the phone. I need to speak to Julian Ross. A pause. Then, wrong number. The line went dead. Daniel cursed under his breath. Emily Rivers looked at him with wide eyes. What did he say? He hung up. Emily Carter sighed. Well, that's not suspicious at all. Daniel wasn't deterred. He immediately dialed back. This time, it went straight to voicemail. "Damn it," he muttered. Emily Rivers looked uneasy. "If Julian doesn't want to be found, we might have a problem." Daniel glanced between the two women. "Then we force him out of hiding." Emily Carter smirked. "Now that sounds like something I can get behind. What's the plan?" Daniel pulled out his laptop and started typing. "Julian's an intelligence operative. If he's legit, he won't be easy to track. But if he was meeting with Emily, he had to leave some kind of trail." Emily Rivers frowned. "He never used the same location twice. Always picked public places. No phones, no messages. Just face-to-face meetings." Daniel barely heard her. He was already scanning through his investigative databases, searching for any mention of Julian Ross. 10 minutes passed in tense silence. Then, got him. Emily Carter leaned over his shoulder. "Already?" Daniel smirked. "Turns out, even the best operatives make mistakes. A Julian Ross booked a flight under an alias last week. Destination, Washington, D.C. Emily Rivers stiffened. D.C.? Why would he go there? Daniel's fingers flew across the keyboard. "That's what we're about to find out." A few more keystrokes, and he hacked into airport security footage. The grainy video showed a tall man in a dark coat boarding a plane. Daniel zoomed in on his face. It was Julian. And he wasn't alone. Standing next to him was another man, one Daniel recognized instantly. His blood ran cold. "It's him," he whispered. Emily Carter squinted at the screen. "Who?" Daniel swallowed hard. "The man from my accident." Emily Rivers gasped. "You're sure?" Daniel nodded slowly. Memories flashed through his mind. Blurry images, distorted voices. He had seen that man before, just before the crash. This wasn't just about Julian anymore. Someone else had been pulling the strings all along. Daniel stared at the screen, his pulse pounding. The man next to Julian Ross, the man from his accident, was more than just a shadowy figure. He was the missing piece of the puzzle. Emily Carter crossed her arms. "So what now?" "We book a flight to D.C. and hope Julian welcomes us with open arms?" Daniel shook his head. We don't have that kind of time. If Julian is involved in whatever this is, then someone is watching him too. We need to get to him before they do." Emily Rivers hesitated. "But how? He's already in D.C. We don't even know where to start." Daniel's eyes darkened. "We make him come to us." 24 hours later, Washington, D.C. The city was alive with movement, but Daniel only focused on one thing: the coffee shop across the street. He adjusted the earpiece in his ear and spoke softly. "Any sign of him?" Emily Carter's voice crackled in. "Not yet, but this place is way too public. Are you sure he'll show?" "He will." Emily Rivers, sitting at a table nearby with a newspaper in front of her, sipped her coffee. "And if he doesn't?" Daniel exhaled. "Then we find another way." Minutes passed. Then, "I see him," Emily Carter whispered. Julian Ross entered the cafe, scanning the room cautiously. He was alone. Daniel stood and walked straight toward him. "Julian?" The man's eyes widened slightly. He turned to leave. Daniel grabbed his arm. "We need to talk." Julian exhaled sharply. "You shouldn't have come here." "Yeah, well, I didn't have a choice," Daniel said. "You owe me some answers." Julian looked around, then sighed. "Fine. 5 minutes." They sat in the farthest corner of the cafe. Julian leaned in. "You don't understand what you're involved in, Cross." "Then explain it to me." Julian hesitated. Then he whispered, "The accident wasn't an accident, and it wasn't just about you." Daniel tensed. "What do you mean?" Julian glanced around. "They knew you were getting close. They needed you out of the way. But when they realized you survived, they changed the plan." Daniel narrowed his eyes. Who are they? Julian hesitated again. The man from your accident. His name is Victor Hale. And he's not just some enforcer. He's the real mastermind behind everything. Daniel's breath caught. Hale. Julian nodded. He's been controlling things from the beginning. Your investigation, your accident, even Emily. Daniel's heart slammed in his chest. What about Emily? Julian hesitated, then sighed. She was never supposed to be part of this. But Hale made sure she was. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Where is he now? Julian exhaled. Closer than you think. That night, Daniel waited in his hotel room. He knew Victor Hale would come. He was right. The door creaked open. A figure stepped inside. Daniel, Hale said with a smirk, you should have let this go. Daniel raised his gun. I don't let things go. Hale chuckled. That's what makes you predictable. In a flash, Hale lunged. A struggle broke out. They crashed into furniture, fists flying. Hale was strong, but Daniel fought with everything he had. A gunshot rang out. Silence. Hale stumbled back, clutching his side. He looked at Daniel in shock, then collapsed. Daniel stood over him, breathing heavily. It was over. 1 week later, Daniel sat in his apartment, staring at the skyline. The truth was out. Hale was dead. Julian had disappeared. And Emily, she was gone too. Daniel didn't know if he'd ever see her again, or if he even wanted to. But one thing was certain. The past was finally behind him. He took a deep breath, closed his laptop, and walked away.